Growing up as a young comic book fan in the 80s and 90s was not easy. All you current comic book fans have it so easy, but I grew up in the dark times, my friends. We were glad when anything comic book related was adapted for movies or TV. We were so desperate that we would make excuses for anything. Superman 3? Hey, he got to fight an evil Superman, Generation X. Look, they're in the X-Mansion. Howard the Duck? Yeah, I got nothing. But every once in a while, someone would get it right. Richard Donner's Superman started it all, but it was Tim Burton's Batman in 1989 that really started to change things. Sure, we eventually got duds like Batman and Robin, but the 90s also gave us Batman the Animated Series, and Blade. Yet for a long time, there was one TV show that was mostly ignored for years. It wasn't until 28 years later that it was showered with love, and truly appreciated for all it did for comic book media. I am, of course, talking about The Flash, the TV series from 1990. Long before Grant Gustin raced onto TV sets in 2014, there was another Scarlet Speedster who was the trailblazer for the Speed Force. So before we see yet another Flash breaking the sound barrier, let us talk about the original, and to me the best hero to ever wear the lightning bolt, in this episode of Gone, but Not Forgotten. After the massive success of Tim Burton's Batman, Warner Bros. Television was trying to develop different DC Comics characters for some TV shows on CBS, to milk the superhero interest that Batman had sparked. During this time, writing duo Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo pitched a show called Unlimited Powers, which revolved around an older Flash and a group of young superheroes, who would be fighting a war against supervillains secretly controlling the world. The network passed, but were impressed with the script. So when CBS president Jeff Sagansky gave the order to make a Flash TV show, they were the ones tapped to develop it. Fun fact for you, as they were making the show, Bilson and DeMeo were also writing another superhero movie, The Rocketeer, one of my favorite superhero movies of all time, right up there in the top 5. I know many people might disagree with me, but I stand by that statement. Anyway, back to The Flash. The casting of Barry Allen was particularly interesting, as 60 actors auditioned for the lead of The Fastest Man Alive. DeMeo and Bilson had originally wanted Richard Burgi for the role. Supposedly, Jack Coleman was even offered the character, but he turned it down because he didn't want to play a superhero and wear a costume. You have to take that with a grain of salt though, because I could not find any proof of this. But the network pushed for soap opera star John Wesley Shipp, who was at first reluctant to take the role. He had no idea who this character was. He asked if it was the classic sci-fi hero Flash Gordon, but the main reason for his trepidation was the common belief that superheroes were a joke. Like many people at the time, Shipp thought of the Adam West Batman TV show whenever he heard the word superhero. But legendary casting director April Webster talked to him about how DeMeo and Bilson wanted to make the show more like the Richard Donner Superman. Then she told Shipp to just read the script and come back with his opinion. John read the script and was blown away. Shipp said that some of his favorite aspects of the pilot were Barry's family dynamic. In the pilot, Barry was the runt of the family, the nerd in a family of jocks. He was intrigued by the concept of Barry's wish to give up his powers and become normal again, only to wind up using them to avenge his brother's murder and make the world a better place. John said that it was something he never expected to read on a superhero TV show. So once he got the approval from DeMeo and Bilson, he signed up for the role. Now, as a fan, I was thrilled to see the Flash suit recreated so accurately for this show. Robert Short designed the costume for this series. Short has had a long career in Hollywood and is still working today. He worked closely with Tim Burton on Beetlejuice and won an Oscar for his makeup effects in the film. This was a blessing, because the network was against having Barry in the classic Flash costume. They wanted a costume in a more realistic style. At one point, they wanted to have Barry in a tracksuit. But Bilson and DeMeo told them, "The guy worked with the man who was responsible for the highest grossing film in the past decade. He won a freaking Oscar. I think you should trust him." Shipp said that the costume was a struggle to wear. He would sweat so badly that at the end of the day, they would take his gloves off and they were filled with sweat up to his wrists. It was like wringing a wet sponge. It was so hot that they put a vest with tubing inside the costume, so they could pump ice water that would circulate his body to keep him cold. Years later, Shipp said that if he could have a say in it, he would have had the Flash barely appear in the frame. He wanted the character to be so fast that you could only see pieces of his costume, to create a more dramatic effect when you did clearly see him. He also would have had the Flash not talk, so as to create an intimidating atmosphere around the character. The look of this show was particularly amazing. Tim Burton's Batman was obviously a huge influence, but there were also some of Max Fleischer's Superman cartoons thrown in as well. The showrunners said that they wanted to mix a modern and a 1940 aesthetic together, so that you would see 1940s and 50s cars, as well as seeing computers. Many viewers were immediately impressed with the Flash. The reason Bilson and DeMeo said was that they respected the source material.
It's nice to hear people say, like yourself now, that, oh, you guys were ahead of your time. But, you know, the fact is we were not ahead of our time when you compare it to the medium that we were adapting. We were, that's where comic books were at in the mid-'80s, and that's what we were mostly influenced by, was that attitude. And so, the Frank Miller, Watchmen, Alan Moore era, and what Howard was doing, I mean, it was all that attitude, the kind of re-examination and renaissance, and a renaissance of comics aimed more at adults and what Dave was doing. I mean, we were absolutely reacting to that, and it was television and the movies that were behind the times,
It was also fun to see little Easter eggs thrown in for sharp-eyed comic book fans. Some of my favorite ones were that Star Labs was located on 50 Garrick Avenue, which was a nod to the Golden Age Flash. At one point, Barry's love interest, Tina, mentions the name of a doctor named Carter Hall, also known as Hawkman. Then you had actors like Robert Shane, who had played Inspector Henderson in the 1950s George Reeves' Superman, as well as so many more. The cast on this show was excellent, probably the most well-known of them being Barry's love interest, Christina "Tina" McGee, played by the beautiful and talented Amanda Pays. Pays was well known at the time for being on another 1980s sci-fi TV show, Max Headroom. This worked well for the Flash, as she was already used to talking technobabble and making it sound believable. The chemistry between Pays and Shipp was off the charts. Unfortunately, this caused actress Paula Marshall her role as Iris West on the show. The showrunners felt they couldn't sustain two love interests for Barry Allen. They said, "We painted ourselves in a corner. We want him to be single so that he could date someone for an episode or two, but also have a main love interest as well. We couldn't do that if we had Iris on the show." But even though this show was well written, well acted, and well shot, there were plenty of problems. Of course, anyone who has seen previous episodes of Gone But Not Forgotten already knows the answer why. The network.
Watch a new Young Show next Thursday on CBS.
Yes, once again, we have network interference that caused headaches for our two showrunners. The big issue was that the network didn't want any supervillains on the show. They wanted real-life villains, such as mobsters. So DeMeo and Bilson had to be clever and incorporated some sci-fi elements into the episodes. But things began to change when they pushed through a supervillain episode. In one of my favorite episodes, Ghost in the Machine, the show introduced a Golden Age hero named Nightshade. It was a fun episode, as it introduced the idea that Central City had a legacy of superheroes. Comic book fans will catch that Nightshade looked just like the Golden Age superhero known as the Sandman. The plot of the episode revolved around an old supervillain known as the Ghost, who fought Nightshade back in the 1950s and escaped by going into suspended animation. He awakens in 1990 and fights both the Flash and an older Nightshade. The episode was good not only for the action, but also for the acting. Anthony Stark crushed it as the Ghost, and Jason Bernard brought a regal quality to the role of Nightshade. He'd later come back in another episode to mentor Barry on the dangers of being a superhero. John Wesley Shipp said that had there been a second season, he would have become a recurring character who would continue to mentor Barry. This was the episode when things began to change. CBS saw a rise in the ratings, so DeMeo and Bilson used this to begin pushing for more comic book related episodes. Things exploded when one of the most popular episodes of The Flash aired, The Trickster. Fun fact about this episode, Mark Hamill was the one who approached Paul DeMeo and Danny Bilson to play the Trickster. Hamill was a fan of the show, and a lifelong comic book geek. This episode would also prove to be the origin of his future voice for the Joker, as Mark's voice for the Trickster is practically the beta version of the Joker. Hamill would develop that voice over time, and it's pretty cool to see the beginnings of it. After that episode, the ratings went through the roof, and now the network wanted supervillains. Mirror Master was introduced. There's this funny scene in the Mirror Master episode that had Barry pretend to be a scientist called Professor Zoom. Captain Cold would also have a pretty cool episode as well. One of my favorite episodes was called Twin Streaks, where Barry has to fight his clone named Pollux. Not only is it action-packed, but it's got some very emotional moments. This also happens to be one of Ship's favorite episodes as well. And some great guest stars who popped up in the series included Adam West, Angela Bassett, and even Bryan Cranston, just to name a few. Alice Cooper was supposed to be in an episode, but turned it down because he would have been playing a drug addict. The music on this show was absolutely amazing. The main theme was created by legendary composer Danny Elfman, who as many know is responsible for another comic book hero's theme in the 1989 Batman, as well as the theme for the Batman animated series. The Flash also had another Batman connection, because the main composer for the show was the late great Shirley Walker, who also did the music for Batman the Animated Series. It's a shame she passed away back in 2006, because not only was she talented, but was also a mentor to many composers. She was a pioneer and a role model to women in a field dominated by men. Her score on The Flash is available to purchase, but from what I saw, only on CD. If you get a chance, I suggest you pick it up. It's worth the buy. Now, as I stated before, the series was heavily comic book inspired, and some of the best episodes were written by comic book legends Howard Chaykin and John Francis Moore. Chaykin was a script consultant on the show, who would go on to be involved in other awesome shows like Earth, Final Conflict, and Viper. John Francis Moore was also a consultant as well as a story editor. He wrote on many comic book properties, such as The Human Target, and one of my favorite shows, Superboy. But even though the ratings started to get better, problems began to arise on the series. It was one of the most expensive TV shows at the time, with an average episode coming in at a whopping $1.6 million. That is $2.5 million with inflation today. So when the show began to be interrupted for sports, Gulf War coverage, and George Bush puking at a Japanese state dinner, the outlook of the series' future became concerning. Then they began to be moved around to different time slots without any warning to viewers, which guaranteed its cancellation. And thus, on May 18th, 1991, the final episode of The Flash aired. The fans were very disappointed, especially when they learned that the second season would have ended up focusing on the Rogues. It seemed like we would never see the Scarlet Speedster on TV ever again. But 24 years later, Barry Allen once again put on his boots and raced among the airways to be met with rave reviews. The new Flash show was amazing, with Grant Gustin as Barry Allen and his friends at Star Labs putting away supervillains on a weekly basis. But the best part of all was that John Wesley Shipp was cast as Barry's father. Flash fans thought it couldn't get any better until they saw Shipp racing across the multiverse, once again wearing his classic costume. Finally, original fans of the show now had closure when we learned that Tina and Barry got married, finally putting to bed the will they or won't they aspect of the original show that viewers had loved. Then during the multi-part Crisis of Infinite Earths saga, the 1990 Flash passed the baton on to the new Speedster and sacrificed himself to save the multiverse.
I have faith in you, Tina.
Well, the truth is I have faith in you, too.
So after that amazing ending for the original Flash, you're probably wondering, how could the show ever come back? Well, I do think it should return. but not in the way you think. What if we were to see the Flash's adventures between the time of cancellation and his end in the Crisis crossover? We could make it an animated show, and have some of the original writers working on the episodes. Although sadly, Paul DeMeo passed away back in 2018, leaving behind him a legacy of work in comics, film, TV, and video games. Currently, the original Flash is only available to stream on Amazon and sold on DVD, although some fans have uploaded a few episodes on YouTube. What's amazing is that they converted it to HD, something that even Warner Brothers has yet to do themselves. I highly suggest you check this show out. After all these years, it still holds up. But even if we don't see Ship becoming the 1990s Flash ever again, it was still a good run. During the dark times of comic book media, the Flash was the beacon of hope for comic book fans everywhere. I know I'll always be thankful that I was there when I saw that symbol racing across my TV screen. At the time of this episode, the current Flash TV show ends this year, and the Flash movie is finally ready to premiere in theaters. It's funny that years from now, Flash fans will cite either of those properties as their Flash. In their view, Grant Gustin or Ezra Miller are the only Flashes. But real comic book fans know that if it wasn't for two comic book geeks back in the 1990s, we would never have known how awesome the concept of super speed could really be. I'm Jesse Shade speaking on behalf of Dave Arroyo for JoBlo.com, and thanks again for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to the JoBlo Originals channel. Tell all your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We are an independent company that appreciates all of your support, and we will see you next time for the next episode of Gone, but Not Forgotten.